Hey guys, what's up? It's New. Today I want to give you a cool video. We're going to be doing a mechanical breakdown, a kind of deep dive on Tempest, Flurry, Tempest, Bell combo, how incredibly strong it is single target, whether you're doing it on Monk or Gemling Legionnaire, whether you're doing it attribute stacking or not, or whether you're even doing this build or not, because almost anyone could probably get something out of this video. It's going to be a very deep look into damage, how all the different damage comes together, how it all multiplicatively applies or additively applies. If you're somebody who came from a different ARPG, let's say, and you're kind of new to PoE and you talk in terms of damage buckets, I think you're going to get a lot out of this video. You're going to have a much better understanding about how damage works. Of course, if you are running this build or anything like it, it's going to definitely help solidify your understanding about how to do as much damage as you possibly can. In the case of this build, we'll also be talking a little bit about resource management, mana in particular. And yeah, because that is definitely kind of an issue with the build, or can be, and is for a lot of builds right now. So that is a Xesht tier 4 kill. That's a pinnacle boss, the highest level, without party bonuses. He doesn't have a damage reduction, I don't think, unlike Arbiter at the moment. But this setup does take a lot to achieve. It is very high end. Most of what I'm saying is going to apply to low end as well, okay? At least in terms of like understanding, especially in terms of just understanding the game more broadly speaking. So if you are someone in any of those camps, I certainly hope you watch this video. I think you can get a lot of value out of it. All right, so the character's up on the screen. You can get some sense of the stats here. You see it does have pretty good stats, almost resistance capped with the current setup. But anyway, you don't have to have a character that's crazily geared in order to pull off what I did. I mean, maybe you do to kill the boss in 1 second, but not 2 seconds, 3 or 4 seconds or something like that. But anyway, we're going to be looking at Path of Building at the end. So I do have a separate section for that. And all along the way, we're going to be separating everything out by damage type or damage component or damage bucket, if you will. Timestamps linked down below for all of that. For Path of Building, it is still quite scuffed now. You've heard a lot of other content creators say they don't really want to provide POB links or really talk about it, because while it is a tremendously valuable resource to help us understand and essentially build a character and build it before we play it and kind of have the full picture of it, that's how potent it is as a third-party program. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it is still really good, and I do have a link down below for it. And I did, in this particular case, meticulously populate things to try to represent a realistic look on the damage. I do need to talk about a few things in there, so we will be dedicating a little bit of time to that at the very end of the video. Anyway, normally I have more dexterity than strength or intelligence. In fact, I usually have around 500 strength, 500 int, and 900 dex currently. Very well geared at the moment. But you'll see I have way more int than anything else at the moment. Why is that? Well, first major change, let's talk about some of the tweaks that I did to the build to make it much more viable, single target. Otherwise, my mana management is completely terrible, so I have to fix that for one thing. You'll notice everything is blue. All of the travel nodes attributes are blue. Yep, they were all green before, they were all dex before, now they're blue. So what did this do? It took me from about 1,300 mana to almost, well, around 2,000 mana, which is pretty incredible, especially combined with Melting Maelstrom. It gives me a much bigger window of time while that mana just keeps getting dunked instantly, and that's because of Cast on Crit, proccing like 24 times a second. This works really well, so this is probably the single best thing I can do. Another incredibly good thing to do for if you're focusing on bossing is to just forget about frenzy charges and focus strictly on power charges with resonance, and that is through Combat Frenzy, okay? Combat Frenzies here, and yes, Charge Infusions here. That is a 20% multiplier to critical strike chance with power charges and being able to get charge staff. Kind of important. I don't care about Flicker Strike for single target, but yeah, power charge is definitely more important than Frenzy. And this is the nice side bonus of giving me endurance charges through Profane Ritual, Cast on Crit in the event that I'm care at all about the trash before the boss, but you know, we're not really focusing on that. So yeah, got Resonant, switched out all the decks for int, and then the other major things are a couple of gems. I'm not running Flicker Strike, so I pulled Inspiration that was here, didn't even replace it with anything, and threw it in Cast on Crit, because this is just costing way too much mana. Voltaic Mark and Eye of Winter, even at their lowest mana cost levels, proccing 24 times a second, that is what is responsible for seeing my mana just completely get dunked constantly. And so getting Inspiration support in there helps a ton. Okay, I used to run it like that anyway. What was here was Profusion, so that got moved down to Combat Frenzy anyway. A nice convenient place to put it. And that's basically it. That's basically all I did. I didn't turn off Herald of Thunder. I didn't turn off Herald of Ash. I didn't turn off Grim Feast. You know, these things actually technically have no value in a single target on a fight. And yes, you know, we could have done the whole huge workaround with summon Skeletal Warrior, sacrifice, get power charges out of combat. There's a particular way to do that, but I don't want to create a massive workaround. I just want to do a couple little quick tweaks. For one thing, I'll forget, you know, something when I keep switching back and forth. And, you know, I'm not going all embossing at any point anyway, but you can look into that if you want. I just wanted to do a couple of quick tweaks. So for anyone who's following the build very closely, that's all I did, really. That's basically it. Yeah, so quick recap on mana management. Switching out all the travel attribute nodes to intelligence. On a side point, resonance, keystone for power charges. And then the other big thing was inspiration in cast on crit. And so what this does is it takes me from like 1400 mana all the way over 2000, and it gives me a bunch more mana regen, and that gives me a lot more room to work with for the Melting Maelstrom. I don't have to be quite nearly as precise with the timing of like spamming it or whatever. Incidentally, you spam this flask like 10 or 12 times. I only had to use it once or twice on that boss kill, so my gear could have been much worse. To be fair, the mana flask is one of the more expensive components of the build, so even if you had a regular flask, well, for one thing, you'd probably attack a lot slower because you'd have a lot less dexterity because you're much less geared, so that would kind of help out in general. But even if you weren't doing attribute stacking, well, then you'd be using like a real staff with real amount of physical damage, and then, you know, you would have, you know, something like Soul Thief or mana leech rings. I even made a video on this before, solutions. So there's all kinds of solutions for fixing mana depending on what you're doing. When they eventually nuke attribute stacking version of this build, we're going to all have like, you know, huge physical DPS staff. It's actually going to go, that solution will, or that problem will kind of solve itself naturally, because we won't be attacking nearly as fast, and we'll be actually getting some serious mana leech on the build. All right, so we're now going to get into the damage, where it's coming from. Let's talk about the active skills and play it first, because that is, of course, the most important thing to understand how all the skills tie together. This is not a one-button build. There's actually quite a bit going on here. The primary button that is used at all times is right-click, in my case, Tempest Flurry. Now, again, because of some mana management issues, it's level 5. For anyone who's having massive problems with mana management, in most cases, the major culprit is they're trying to run a level 20 Tempest Flurry. And if you run a level 20 Tempest Flurry, even with no supports in there, no extra cost, it just instantly drains all the mana. If I were to plug that in right now, my mana is just gone in like 5 seconds flat, just from holding right click. So level 5 Tempest Flurry means my mana is actually completely stable in this case. Tempest Bell is the single greatest contributor to single target. It is doing, I estimate, roughly 80 to 90%. Responsible for 80 to 90% of the single target damage, and that is because it offers a tremendous amount of extra damage when you just attack it with fast attacks. All elemental ailments are in play: Ignite, Chill, Freeze, Shock, and Electrocute. Even Electrocute, yep, in the Tempest Flurry. And Shock is coming from Charge Staff, which we'll look at in a second. Each elemental ailment adds damage of that archetype, and then it is additional damage, 30% more. If you look at it in the PoE2 DB or PoE2 Wiki, it will express there. It's 30% more damage, so we're effectively getting 150% more damage from Tempest Bell, 150% more of the shockwave damage that you'll see on there. And this helped me determine how much actual damage it is doing in the Path of Building, which we'll look at a little bit later on. Charge Staff, we need to trigger it, preferably to get 5 stacks. Max power charge is 5, but it's not that important. We really need to just hit it at least once. Carrying it into the boss arena is great if you can. For Xesht you can. For Arbiter and King of the Mist I don't think you can, but for literally every other fight in the game right now I'm pretty sure you can just carry this buff into the boss fight. A little harder to do power charges though, because we're running Charge Infusion, which gives 20% more crit damage, and crit's going to play a big role in the damage. Of course, Combat Frenzy with Resonance Keystone is what's giving us the power charges. So just to recap, 3 active skills: Tempest Flurry, Tempest Bell, Charge Staff. Now, the way this works is constantly Tempest Flurrying with Charge Staff, giving me essentially double attacks, super fast attacks going into the Tempest Bell. It will proc it very quickly. Also on the boss, Cast on Crit is going to go off really often. This is no global cooldown. We have no internal global cooldown. We have basically 100% chance to crit when everything is up. And what this is going to result in is going to very quickly start proccing Cast on Crit, and then Eye of Winter is going to be going out very quickly, progressively more quickly, because once Eye of Winter starts going out, then it starts proccing the Bell too, extremely frequently, and the boss for that matter. And so it just very quickly just ramps up to the moon it's all within like 2 or 3 seconds, or no, less than that. What am I saying? About half a second, honestly. This just ramps up into full. And yeah, Voltaic Mark is also involved. This is going to be yet another form of damage. Will be Shock, and we'll talk about that also later in the video. There are some other skills that are essentially not involved whatsoever. Herald of Ash, Herald of Thunder, Grim Feast have literally no value for a single target. I just leave them on because, again, I'm not trying to come out and make something that is just strictly a bosser. I just want just a few little tweaks, just a couple really smart tweaks to the build to make it very strong for bossing, make it more reliable and easier to manage with mana. Now let's get into the support gems, where I could also be doing a lot more to do more damage, particularly on Tempest Bell, not using the strongest supports. But there are many support gems in the game. Originally, when they were creating the game, they didn't really want it damage supports to contribute to, but for whatever reason, they decided to go ahead and do that. Martial Tempo is, I mean, some would argue this is actually the most important support gem in the entire build, because it has allowed me a more attack speed multiplier, which is just going to make everything proc and go much faster. Rage is going to be yet another damage component. I guess I'm getting ahead of myself here, and I just keep talking about that. But these don't actually give increased extra damage, not directly, just indirectly. Bullseye, we have Falcon Dive, so we get increased speed from having accuracy. That's why that's there. Electrocute is there to increase the Bell's damage from the extra elemental ailment. And obviously, it also stuns the enemies, again, not on bosses, but actually really, really nice out on maps. Now, this means I cannot shock with Tempest Flurry, and that might be a little weird because I think most Gemling Legionnaires have Tempest Flurry responsible for their shocks. Now, again, it's just level 5, so I don't care as much about damage. I'm going to use Charge Staff for that. Neural Overload, it's just basically for mapping. Now, Tempest Bell, one mandatory support for the highest damage is Overabundance, because you can't put a second bell down if your first bell is still up, unless you have Overabundance. You can't even begin to get combo points for it unless you have Overabundance. So it's super important to have this up. And very early on in the gearing process, even with very poor gear, this is one of the best things. Persistence helps increase the duration of the bell, because it only lasts like 2 seconds or something. Although I do have some global increased skill effect duration, but anyway. First major damage, direct damage bonus here, Primal Armament, very good for the bell. And then we have Execute over here, which will increase some damage as well. Under 35% life, that's what low life is. Monsters will take 40% more damage. This is really smart to put in the bell too, because it tends to just be, you know, the ramp up and everything contributes even harder at the tail end of the monster's life. Now, I have a couple damage supports in here, or one in here. This one doesn't actually do a whole lot. It's very sensible to put in the bell because less attack speed doesn't really matter for the bell procs, just for slamming it down. And the Soul Thief is the only source of mana leech that I have. Now, mana leech is extremely good. I made another video on it before, but it's not needed for this version of the build. I'm just way overkill with the amount of mana I have with the flask and everything. So it's just nice, a little bit of breathing room. And again, if I were to take this super seriously, I wouldn't be using mana Soul Thief and Heavy Swing. I'll be using a couple other crazy strong. I'll be using like Rising Tempest in here and a few other good things. Speaking of which, Rising Tempest is in Charge Staff. Now, Charge Staff is not a major player to damage. It's like, roughly 5, maybe 10% of total damage. But we do have Conk Effect. That's going to be more damage. Rising Tempest. Momentum is should be working. Definitely when I'm moving and Charge Staff is going out. But standing in place, single target, probably not getting any effectiveness out of it. Although I wouldn't be surprised if the game is programmed such that it does register me moving doing this. I just said I wouldn't be surprised. Anyway, Overcharge and Coursing Current. Coursing Current for napping specifically, but Overcharge is going to be extremely good for a single target. Get that extra shock. Again, we'll talk about that real soon. Now that I mentioned that the bell is the primary source of damage, I'll just open up this window here. This is shock waves, and as you can see, there's some flat damage going on here. There's physical, fire, cold, and lightning. Now, this doesn't just come out of thin air. You need some flat damage, some source of flat damage to begin with. Obviously, if you don't have a weapon, you're not doing any flat damage, so you're not doing any damage whatsoever. And so the most sensible first thing to look at is flat damage. Where is all this flat damage looking at? These numbers look pretty big, but it starts with some relatively low rolled flat damage. For example, on Pillar of the Caged God, which is the attribute stacking weapon, we have 11 to 22 flat physical damage. And that is the lowest you'll ever see on an in-game build. There's no way that you're going to run something that low. People end up having like 700 DPS, physical DPS weapons in the end, but they don't have those 3 lines with area of effect, attack speed, and weapon damage per strength, which we'll talk about in just a moment. 2 other big sources of flat damage will be the rings, or both rings, I suppose. And that would be right here with physical. In the case of this breach ring, we got tier 9 physical and lightning. In the case of the sunset ring, we got tier 8 cold and physical. It would be best if I had at least one source of fire, but I don't. So I do need to ignite somewhere. In this case, I had to anoint volcanic skin to get some fire. And that is a halfway decent damage passive point anyway, but I would prefer to just have flat fire because I would anoint something else. In my case, actually, the best anoint would be probably Wildstorm. Because as we can see, most of that flat damage is definitely lightning. So, again, rings can flat damage there, and then the weapon, assuming that you have it. Now, the more flat damage you have, the less it matters on the rings. Like if you have a huge amount of flat damage on your weapon, it doesn't matter as much on rings. But for this very particular build, flat damage on ring matters a lot, especially because attributes also matter. And so let's talk about attributes. Attributes is another source of damage, and the more attributes you have, the less impactful it is, the more impactful flat damage is. The more flat damage you have, the less impactful it is, the more impactful attributes is. So you need a mix of both, and that's exactly why these rings look this way. I recently hit the third suffix on here, so I got an absolute banging good ring here with triple attributes. And then this breach ring is, I mean, this was actually kind of a lucky craft. I got a long time ago. Double rarity, but 2 top tier attribute rolls. And then, of course, we have Astramentus, which is just giving a huge amount of attributes. This helmet's giving a bunch of attributes. And then Ingenuity is doubling or almost doubling the effectiveness of the flat damage and attributes. That's why, you know, it's so powerful, because we get so much value out of attributes and flat damage. The rings are essentially the most important rolls on the entire build, because Ingenuity is just, again, almost doubling the effectiveness of that, feeding into the complete lack of flat damage on the weapon and the extreme scaling that takes place on the weapons through attributes. So for attributes, we get a bunch of damage per 5 strength. However, the number is not all that impressive because, again, it only does 11 to 22. It's only looking at the local damage on there. Now, incidentally, if you're just kind of leveling this build or you're starting and you're on low budget, I would recommend getting a flat roll, cold damage probably, for freeze, on this like corrupted or even socketed and flat damage, and then scaling strength above anything else, because then you can get a bunch of life from passive strength, and then you get a bunch of weapon damage, and it's actually be more impactful that way. So that's a slight recommendation if you're on the much lower end gearing threshold. Most people know about Hand of Wisdom in action. This thing is so unbelievably strong. It's good even if you're not attribute stacking, but if you are, well, then it's just godly. And then if you can happen to get super expensive corruptions that increase the numbers beyond their caps, then it's just outrageously strong. And that's what these gloves are. It gives us a huge amount of attack speed and flat lightning per 10 intelligence. And so this is where most of our damage is actually coming from. It's a flat lightning. How much flat lightning is that? I mean, I'm not going to do the calculation off my head, but I got 746 lightning. That's 1 to 12 per 10. I mean, you do the math. That is why that's one reason why Charge Staff, with its, you know, meager 1 to 22 times 5, is really not all that meaningful. That's why, you know, for a while I was playing without Charge Staff, because this is just completely overriding it in terms of flat damage. So we get a huge amount of flat here, and to be fair, it is so much that it does kind of dwarf the flat rolls on rings, but you still want to have cold archetype, you still want to have fire somewhere. Physical is nice for some leech anyway, but yeah, you will find that completely abandoning flat damage on rings is not a good idea. A little more attribute stacking is going on over here. You know, we do have some cool things like spaghettification, % increase attributes. We got these down here, polymathy, % increase attributes. We got Jack of all trades, which is a huge amount of damage per the lowest 5 of the lowest attribute. And then we have Falcon Dive, which is indirectly giving us attack speed per Dex, because Dex gives accuracy. And then more directly, we have Falcon Technique, which is, again, very, very strong attack speed per Dex. And this is why Tempest Flurry, if you didn't know why Tempest Flurry allows me to move faster than I can run, that's because it is based on attack speed. And it is probably not by design for you to be able to actually Tempest Flurry faster than you can jog, or at least not way faster. That is just on account of super high-end scaling, and it does make this build incredibly fun and satisfying to play in maps especially. It doesn't really matter for bossing, but it is one of the reasons why it's incredibly popular, because it's one of the few ways to get an extreme amount of attack speed. It's not Temporalis build, it's not a Queen of the Forest build, it is simply Tempest Flurry running crazy fast. Again, this is me going slow, because I pulled all the dex points and put them all into int. Again, usually I have a lot more run speed. I think I had like 15 attacks per second, but normally I have over 20. Or I think like 22 or 23 in combat. Percent increase damage is the classic way to scale damage. All right, that's obviously a scaler there. And that exists in a few places. We have a little bit here. Increased damage if I've dealt a critical hit in the last 8 seconds. So that's conditional. That's going to look quite familiar to the D4 players. Something like that. And honestly, there are a lot of sources sprinkled here and there. You know, we have increased attack damage here. We got increased melee damage over here. If you take this melee attack, elemental, specific elemental damage, they are all wrapped up into the exact same bucket. They're all additive with one another. So anytime it says percent increased damage, it's all the same. I do have quite a few sources of it. Maybe a little bit on jewels as well. I guess I don't have a huge amount, but you definitely want a fair bit of it scattered throughout the build. But you'll typically get it, you know, you can get it on rings, you can get it all over the place. But the passive tree, and for most builds, the passive tree is going to have an ample amount to hit the mark on that. Gained as extra is another really powerful form of damage that is privy to the monk in a big way. It's one reason why I like the monk over Gemling Legionnaire, who gets an incredibly powerful notable by increasing the effectiveness of the attributes passive bonuses, but the other 3 remaining ones are kind of meh. The monk has 4 very good ones, 2 of which are gained as extra, one for cold and one for lightning. 10% is no small amount. That's a lot of damage. They also come with extra side benefits. So I am the Blizzard and I am the Thunder are really, really good. We'll talk a little bit more a little later on about Sunder by Enemies, which is a very uniquely powerful one for bosses. But we also have a few extra places to get even more of this. The monk does. And I took these for a very long time until the very end of the build. Essence of the Storm for an additional 5% as extra lightning, and then Essence of the Mountain, 5% is extra cold. And then again, just as a reminder, Volcanic Skin is anointed, and so this is 8% damage as extra fire. And I mean, anybody could get this as an anoint, but in my case, I needed fire damage primarily to ignite the bell, to get that extra damage for the bell. And now we'll move on to percent enemy increased damage taken. Now, I almost made a totally separate video on this because I am scaling damage like crazy in this way. Even though it's kind of hard to do so, I have really scaled the bejesus out of shock. That's why I introed the video highlighting the shock effect, 97%. I've been told 100% is cap. I mean, that'd be nice because I've basically scaled it as much as I want. I got 97, so I'm really close to there. 97% increased damage taken is its own separate multiplier for damage. So I'm effectively doubling the damage of the build by doing that much shock. Now, shock in Path of Exile 1 works very differently. If you crit, you shock. Depending on the impact, it's between 5 and 50%, caps out at 50. However, with the Warden Ascendancy, new Warden Ascendancy, it would work differently. You get 2% stacking up to 50 times for a total of 100%. So we got 100% shock with the Warden. It was incredibly powerful. We played Tornado Shot, really, really strong. I mean, anyone who was doing that build knew how potent that was. So that is nothing to snuff at. Nearly 100% shock effect, and here's how you get it. Okay, so I guess Spark users kind of already know about this, but a lot of players have no idea about just how strong shock is. You simply need to do enough lightning damage to shock, and it can't have electrocute support in it. And so Charge Staff is doing that. The Bell is also doing that. So I'm always shocking, instantly shocking. Now, the amount of effect isn't determined by how much damage you're doing. It's only determined by magnitude of shock or magnitude of elemental ailments. We have 15. Okay, on the Ascendancy, right here. And we get some shocked ground, so more reliable, some as extra lightning. But we get 15 here. I have a Megalomaniac. One of the mods is Harmonic Generator because I believe that this is probably the single strongest notable. It's actually even stronger than Wild Storm, I think, due to the magnitude of shock effect. Really crazy strong. If I'm critting every time, then I'm getting the full effectiveness out of that, except for the very, very first hit. Let's see. We also have a passive down here. Magnitude of non-damaging elements. When you inflict critical strikes, non-damaging elements, shock is on the list. So is freeze and electrocute, so that's pretty nice. Then we got all kinds elsewhere as well, mostly on the jewel. Okay, I got magnitude of shock. I decided to actually prioritize magnitude of shock. It's a prefix, so that's nice. You could even do double crit and magnitude if you wanted, which is pretty wild. We got magnitude of shock here, and even more here. It's really nice jewels, and I think that is about it there. Recall that I said earlier that we'd revisit shock because of overcharge. Okay, this is going to be additive with those other bonuses, so we're getting that number. I mean, it's way over 100. It's over 200 at this point, increased magnitude of shock. So again, that would mean it's like somewhere around 60% instead of 20%. This 75% magnitude of shocks inflicted by charged staff. Now, it doesn't matter if this is the primary source of it. It doesn't keep getting overwritten by lesser shocks. It showcases the highest shock, in which case it would be through charged staff. And then Voltaic Mark. Now, the cool thing about this is, again, something that Gemling Legionnaire is most likely not going to do, is get Voltaic Mark into the build. Now, I could do Frenzy Mark and save Combat Frenzy. For single target, Frenzy Mark actually is totally reliable for getting the Frenzy charges, or in this case, Power charges. But Voltaic Mark is multiplicative with the other form. So if you have a lot of magnitude of shock, then Voltaic Mark becomes more potent, because this is separate multiplier, just like increased damage taken is. Increased shock taken, essentially, is what this is. And yeah, that is a 1.45 multiplier to whatever your shock effect is, and that is how, at the end, the calculation results at 97%. I'm sure you were expecting me to talk about Critical Strike at some point, because obviously that is a really big one, and one that is, I mean, it's just universal. Any ARPG has it, I think. I think the only support gem that even has anything to do with Critical Strike is Ambush, which is the first hit for Flicker Strike. Very sensible to put it here, because I actually have around 50% chance to crit, because I'm getting the other half of it on the back end with Critical Weakness. This stacks up 20 times, and is a 10% flat bonus to enemies crit taken, and that is just like Brittle works, and that is truly almost doubling my crit chance, because I only have 10. Okay, now a real staff would have more local crit chance, but I only have 10, and I get 1 extra here, so it's almost doubling the crit chance. Now, crit chance is all over the tree. It is basically just all on the tree. Okay, we'll open it up one more time here to just remind you, Charged Infusion. This is why I like to have this. Charged Infusion is really good because it gives 20% more crit. And so, you know, my critical strike chance completely out of combat is actually only, well, let's just look at it here on the default. It's only 35%. But in the end, it's 100%, truly. So we got crit all over the place. Just critical strike chain, just anytime. I mean, you can just open it up on PoE. You can just type it in here. There's just crit everywhere. Crit chance, crit multi. We get a huge amount of it in here. And while the numbers may look a little bit low to you here, the crit multi number is pretty high. Definitely stacking that, getting that on all these different jewels as well. Not that one. Sorry, not that one. But yeah, all the other ones, all the other blue ones. Good in crit damage. So definitely focusing on that. Since I'm able to get crit chance to 100, I'm primarily focusing on crit damage otherwise. And attributes don't help with this at all, which is why Gemling Legionnaires don't really prioritize crit, but they do recognize how strong it is, and typically with their pathing, especially over to this area, they will prioritize crit a bit. But this is one thing that sets a monk apart, the Invoker in particular, whereas Legionnaires have to start, their starting zone is absolutely atrocious, and they're basically just instantly going for jewels, because they're just trying to path, and lucky for them, just pathing attribute nodes are fairly strong. The monk gets an insane beginning package here with a bunch of crit multi, some attributes, crit, damage for crit, and then even more crit multi and damage here. Yeah, we just have it all over the place on the tree. We get most of it out of the way. The only wheel that I'm not taking is this one here. And guess what? Well, I'm level 97. So if I had 3 more points, well, I think you know what I'd do with them. The last final damage multiplier that I'm aware of is Rage. Alright, so I got 1 global Rage on melee hit. Good idea to have 1 red gem. I also get 2 maximum Rage, which is nice. So in this game, well, they changed Rage recently in PoE1, but they basically work the same. You have 30 max Rage, in this case 32, and it is a more multiplier damage multiplier for attacks, which is obviously very, very strong. Most people are going to want Rage somewhere in their build. There's even some supports for this, which I remind you, Tempest Flurry does have 3 Rage. This seems to have a sort of internal cooldown, though. You don't actually get it on every single hit, and so it's a really good idea to have global, because you're not necessarily always Tempest Flurry. Sometimes you're moving. Sometimes, you know, you're flicker striking. Sometimes Charged Staff is picking enemies off. Sometimes Charged Staff is actually killing things before Tempest Flurry gets a hit, and your Rage actually starts to drain. It drains very quickly. So it's a really good idea. Outside of maybe single target, it's a very good idea to have at least 1 of these jewels, 1 Rage on melee hit. Some people like to play with like 2 or 3 and then don't even need this support gem. Anyway, figure it out. You test it yourself, and whether you're doing this build or Gemling Legionnaire or not even a quarterstaff build, but you're doing something else with attacks, probably going to want rage. All right, so now I'm going to show you Path of Building. And you're going to see a ton of numbers in here, and there's going to be a link down below which you can pull this up. You can open it up in the regular browser, or you can download this particular third-party application and plug it in yourself and populate things yourself. Again, as a reminder, it is not very user-friendly at the moment, but I'm going to go through what I have to show you here. You can see all the passives are there populated. I got all the jewels in here exactly the same, well, maybe not in the exact same spots, but the exact same jewels that I normally have. By the way, Heroic Tragedy gives a lot of extra ES, transforms strength into ES, because it's not actually Whispers of Doom to get transformed when you have a Varana jewel. And that is why in the configuration, for example, I have to enter it in manually, because again, not user-friendly. Now in Path of Exile 1, most of the time you don't even have to enter in custom modifiers, but in this case I do. I'm going to actually go through these real quickly for you initially. I suppose as an honorary mention to another form of damage, I should have probably mentioned monster resistance plays a role. That is a separate multiplier, and bosses have resistances often. I think this is sort of a blanketed system in Path of Building right now, again, not updated. I've been made aware, I believe Xesht, certainly tier 4 Xesht, has quite a bit of elemental resistance. I think the number, as I saw, was 75 each, so he's particularly high elemental res. However, the monk gets Sunder My Enemies, which critical hits ignore non-negative enemy monster elemental resistances. Unfortunately, I used to give out a little bit of misinformation by accident. I thought before that exposures and curses applied after this, but no, apparently they apply before, which means for the monk, going Sunder My Enemies with a huge critical strike chance, exposures and curses aren't really worth a whole lot. They do impact a little bit out in maps for enemies that don't have resistances, but then again, if you're just deleting them one hit anyway, doesn't matter very much now, does it? So that's why I don't actually have curses or exposure in the build, even though it'd be pretty easy to get lightning exposure for sure. Anyway, this modifier doesn't even work. And in the calculation, so you can see if the boss has 50 all elemental res, look at that, my damage was cut in half basically, according to the full DPS number here. Down here we got Charge Infusion, also doesn't factor that in. We get 20% more critical hit chance from Charge Infusion, and actually there's some side bonuses to that as well, which I forgot to mention before. It consumes power charges, and we get extra bonuses when we consume consume power charges recently, like these small nodes. So Charge Infusion is even better than that. It's actually guaranteeing me that I get that crit multi bonus too, so that's really nice. Shock effect, it can only go up to 20, default 20 right now. It can't even accept numbers above that, so I just hit enemies shocked, and then I don't actually put any numbers in here, and I just put 97 in manually, and nearby enemies take 97% increased damage. That's a workaround for that particular damage bucket, so that is now represented there. And then, much to my surprise, even the Charge Staff buff isn't factored in here. So if I play around and manipulate the numbers with Charge Staff, turn it on and off, compare it to Tempest Flurry or whatever, it's obvious that it's not even giving me the buff, so I got to add that in flat there. And then Execute as a support gem in Tempest Bell forces you to either say it's on or off completely, which isn't really fair. So if I put low life in here, that means the monster's taking execute damage. If not, it's there. So to get a sort of workaround, and again, I had to kind of figure out how much damage that is Tempest Spell doing. Well, if I turn it off, you know, like I said, it's doing roughly like 80 to 90% damage. And so doing a little bit of math there, it's contributing to roughly 18% more damage on average there. So those are some workarounds in there. And we can see it's populated up. Rage does work with 32 max rage. You've got crit recently, non-crit recently. I don't have Innervate or Ice Bite, which is what this is doing here. Enemies chilled, maybe not frozen, maimed, yes. Critically weak, maxed out there. It is still shocked, and then I haven't manipulated any numbers here. We could maybe adjust these a bit, but yeah, they're still the same. These are the permanent act buffs that I took. I do have minus 60 res, practically resistance capped, There are calculations here which you can see where the damage or the breakdown is. Yes, that is actually enough fire damage to ignite the bell, which is the most important thing. There, plenty of fire damage, but this is just Tempest Bell per hit. And then something I really got to talk to you about here is the Tempest Bell setup. So this required quite a bit of work and estimations based on the 1 second kill. This kind of damage should look pretty well right. If I were to click my buttons exactly the proper window I could, and it was already fully ramped, 55 million DPS, that's almost twice as much health as Xesht have. So if everything was fully ramped, that sounds about right off the top of my head. Now, Tempest Bell, this is kind of interesting, the count numbers here for integers and projectiles and things like that. This is kind of a workaround because Path of Building cannot calculate this whatsoever right now. However, I can at least put this on shockwave damage, which is kind of important. And this allows me to inform the app that I have used the ability one time and that it does 25 times the amount of damage effectively. Again, a lot of math involved, kind of figure out how that is, but this is kind of a simplified version because you put the bell down, it can be hit 25 times. And so I'm just kind of leave this as it is. This is definitely not accurate right now. There will be a better implementation of this at some point, but that is a lot of moving parts to figure out exactly how that works. As again, a reminder, Eye of Winter is constantly proccing this, as well as Tempest Flurry, as well as Charge Staff, you know, dozens of times a second. And so the bell is up and then it's down, or it's down and then it's gone. It's down and it's gone. I'm constantly spamming it. And so that is why this number is more representative. If this was just one, well, obviously that isn't accurate at all. So I got to do something here to fix that, and that is what I did. So guys, this is Path of Building, kind of lets you see a little bit more in the numbers. It will get better, so look forward to this more in the upcoming patches as PoE2 becomes a bit more mainstream. I know they're working on a lot on this in the back end. There's all kinds of things in here, and if you're not really familiar with this third-party app, I mean, expect it to be a gold standard that build guides and whatnot will come with Path of Building links, so you can really dig into it. It's almost unfair in the end. When it's working as it should be, or as it is in PoE1, it's almost unfair just how detailed and informative it is. Maybe a little too much so. One last side point, I thought I was crit capped, but actually I was mistaken there. That's only if I do have these 3 points. And so then I'm crit capped, and that definitely looks a little better. But anyway, still very close. So a huge amount of crit multi when all buffs are up. Looking really good. I know these numbers are close to what I have in mind for the very, very end, nearly perfect gear. But guys, that is it. That's it for this build. We weren't talking about defenses and stuff too much, just focusing on damage. I know it was kind of a long video, but I hope you got a lot of value out of it. I hope you were able to, get a much better understanding about how damage works, looking at all the different multipliers. Don't sleep on rage, don't sleep on shock, don't sleep on crit. Well, you're probably not sleeping on attribute stacking because you probably heard about that one. But that one may be going by the wayside in future patches. But that's a lot. It's a lot to take in, a lot of different things to factor in. And this is just for one build. Other builds got other different things too. There's other things that are specialized for other different builds, for caster builds, for ranged builds, and whatnot. Let me know if you guys have any questions in the comment section of the video below. I'd be curious to hear how you guys are approaching your Flurry or Flicker monks or Gemling Legionnaires, especially if there's anything you think I left out, if there's anything I forgot to include in here, if there's something I'm just totally missing out on that I should get in here. I've told you basically everything I know. I think I probably left a couple things out, you know me. But I'm doing my best. Okay, doing my best. That's about as informative as I can get. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.